Hi all, today we'll discuss about gRPC, top 40 gRPC interview question with a Spring Boot. So here we have a top 40 gRPC with a Spring Boot real-time interview question. So the first is, what is gRPC and how does it differ from REST? So we are using REST in a Spring Boot most of the time. So the difference is what is the gRPC and why we are using, and what is the difference from gRPC and REST. So gRPC is a high performance open source RPC framework that is used for the HTTP/2 for transport and protocol buffer. Unlike REST, which is typically used for the HTTP 1.1 and use JSON payload for the serialization. But gRPC offer better performance bidirectional streaming and built-in support for authentication and load balancing and more. So that's why we are using gRPC. The next question is, what are the key features of gRPC? There are many key features in gRPC like HTTP/2 based transport, then protocol buffer for efficient serializations, bidirectional streaming, authentication of load balancing, language agnostics, and support of multiple language and all. So this is the main features of gRPC. The next is, how do you define the gRPC service protocol buffer? So gRPC service is defined using a dot proto file. So example here, this proto buffer is there, single syntax. So this type of syntax we will use for the gRPC service protocol buffer. The next question is, what all are the type of RPC supports by gRPC? So there are multiple type. Is a unary RPC, service streaming RPCs, and then client streaming, and then bidirectional streaming. The next question is, what is protocol buffer? That means protobuf. So protocol buffer means it is a language neutral, platform neutral, extensible mechanism for the serialization structure of data. It is used by the gRPC to define the service method and message type. These all are the intermediate question now. So the next question is, how do you implement gRPC client in a Spring Boot? So if you want to implement the gRPC client in a Spring Boot, so for that we have a gRPC started a gRPC Spring Boot starter. So that we have to add, and then this is the example of configuration which I have to create the configuration Java. So the gRPC client at the rate gRPC client annotations. There we have to mention gRPC server and then these methods. Coming for the next, how do you implement a gRPC server in a Spring Boot? So this is the gRPC client, and then this is the next is gRPC server. So for that also we have gRPC Spring Boot starter that we have to add to set up the server, and then this server implement. This is the code of gRPC server. So at the rate gRPC services, and there we have to mention this class service name, and which we have to implement this gRPC, greater gRPC. Coming for the next, what all are the benefits of using HTTP/2 in gRPC? So there are multiple benefits are there. Some of them is multiplexing, flow control, headers compression, and low latency. The next question is, how does gRPC handle service discovery? So gRPC support various service discovery mechanism like DNS, console, etc. and more that can be configured in client to use a mechanism for discovery gRPC service. The next question is gRPC interceptors and their use cases. So interceptors are middleware that can be used to process request and response before they are handling the actual services method. So they are using logging, authentication, and monitoring. Now we will discuss advanced level gRPC with a Spring Boot interview question. So the next question is, how do you handle error in gRPC? So gRPC used a status code to indicate errors. So that is a status runtime exception on the server side, and the client can catch it and handle accordingly. So status runtime exceptions, through that we will handle this. So this is the examples where we have. Now the next question is, how do you implement authentications in gRPC? You can use TLS for transport security and implement the authentication mechanism in your interceptor. Example, JWT tokens based authentication and all. Coming for the next one, how do you manage versioning in gRPC? So gRPC and Protobuf supports backward forward compatibility. So you can add new fields to your message without breaking existing client and use a number of maintaining compatibility. Coming for the next, what all are the best practice for designing gRPC service? So gRPC service, design a small focus service and use appropriate gRPC like unary streamings and all. Handle error gracefully. Implement authentication authorization. Use appropriate load balancing and service discoveries and all. Coming for the next, how do you optimize performance in gRPC? So using the protobuf for the efficient serialization, use HTTP/2 features like multiplexing and header compressions. Next is implement the caches and load balancing and use a proper thread management and resource allocation. Coming for the practical implementation question. So the next question is, how do you configure TLS in gRPC server with a Spring Boot? So configure your application.yaml or application.property to include TLS settings and use appropriate library to load the certificate. So this is the questions. How do you configure TLS in gRPC servers in a Spring Boot? The next question is, how do you handle load balancing in gRPC? So using gRPC built-in load balancing policy or external tools like Envoy or Linked to manage the load balancing. Coming for the next, how do you implement retry in gRPC? Use retry policy configuration in the client to handle retries the fail request. The next question is, what is the role of a stream observer in gRPC? So a stream observer is used for sending response back to the client in a streaming RPC. It handle both side server and client side streaming. The next question is, how do you integrate gRPC with a Spring Security? So use interceptors to integrate a Spring Security authentication authorization mechanism with the gRPC service. Now we will go for the deployment and monitoring based interview questions with the gRPC with the Spring Boot. The first question here in this deployment part, how do you deploy gRPC service in Kubernetes environment? So use Kubernetes resource like deployment service and ingress to deploy and expose gRPC services. So use config map and secret for the configuration and TLS certificate. The next question, how do you monitor gRPC service? So use tools like Prometheus, Grafana for monitoring implementing interceptors for the collecting metrics, and use distributed tracing tools like Jenkins and Jaegers. The next question is, how do you handle a schema evolution in gRPC? So use protobuf backward forward compatibility features, add new fields and new fields numbers, mark old fields, options and deprecated select. The next question is, what are some common pitfall in gRPC development? Not handling a streaming correctly, misconfiguring timeout and retry, ignoring backward compatibility in protobuf, not securing gRPC channels. So these all are the pitfall. Now the next question is, how do you perform testing in gRPC? Use gRPC testing library for unit and ingress integration test. Mock service using tools like mock and use create a memory. gRPC server for testing. Now we will discuss for advanced topic related for the gRPC with the Spring Boot. So explain bidirectional streaming in gRPC with examples. So bidirectional streaming allow both client and servers to send a stream message for each others. So this is the examples where we will use a bidirectional streaming. Now coming to how do you handle gRPC timeout. So set deadlines on the client side to handle the timeout, deadline timeouts and all. So this is the way which we have to set. The next question is what is gRPC reflections and how it is used. So gRPC reflection allow client to query the server to the service metadata. It is used for debugging and dynamic client generation. Enable reflections on the server side to client use. The next question is how do you implement gRPC health check. So use gRPC health check library to implement health check. Registered health services and client can query to check the status of your service. The next question is how do you perform gRPC load testing. So use tools like GHS, gRPC bench for the load testings for the gRPC services. Simulate multiple client and measure latency throughput this error. Now we will discuss for the real world scenarios related gRPC questions with the Spring Boot. So how do you migrate from REST to gRPC in a microservice based architecture? So gradually introduce gRPC by implementing new service with gRPC and creating gRPC endpoint for existing services. Use a gateway to handle REST to gRPC conversion. So instead of REST, we will use a gRPC conversion for the conversions. Now, how do you handle message size limit in gRPC? Adjust maximum message size on both client and server side using configuration option. Now coming for the next one, what all are the some gRPC alternatives and when should you consider them? So alternative include REST, GraphQL, Thrip. Consider them best on requirement like existing ecosystem, ease of using specific features like querying or schema flexibility. Now the last question is how do you ensure backward compatibility in gRPC service? Use protocol backward compatibility features, add the field and new field numbers and avoid removing and renaming existing features field. So these all are the gRPC related interview questions. So here top 40s gRPC with a Spring Boot real time interview questions for this scenario based. Yeah, thank you.